I'm about to tell you a story about a man who died twice. The first time he buried himself, the second time someone else tried to finish the job, and the space between those two deaths, that's where the truth lives. In the mountains of Montana, where the wind carries secrets and the pines remember everything, there was a man who spent 32 years pretending to be someone else. Not for glory, not for gold, but for a promise he made to a woman whose blood turned the snow red under a winter moon. This is the story of how legends die and how they come back. The sun was setting over Timber Ridge, painting the sky in shades of copper and ash, the kind of light that makes everything look like it's already a memory. Dust hung in the air, stirred by the last breath of wind coming down from the high country, and it settled on everything. The false front buildings, the hitching rails, the worn leather of saddles left too long in the weather. An old man shuffled down the main street, his shadow stretching long and crooked behind him like something that didn't quite fit his body anymore. They called him Old Samuel Crane, though nobody really knew where he'd come from or when he'd first appeared in Timber Ridge. Some said 10 years back. Others swore it was 15. The kind of man you noticed just enough to forget which was exactly how he wanted it. He walked with a heavy limp, his right leg dragging slightly, with each step leaning hard on a gnarled walking stick that looked older than he was. His hair hung long and silver down past his shoulders, unwashed and tangled, and his beard grew wild and unkempt, hiding most of his face except for his eyes. Those eyes were the problem. One eye was clouded over milky white with what looked like cataracts, useless as a stone. But the other eye, the left one, that eye was too sharp, too aware. It scanned the street with the kind of precision that didn't belong to a half-blind old hermit living in a shack 3 miles outside of town. But nobody looked close enough to notice. Nobody cared enough to wonder. Old Samuel made his way toward the trading post boots, scuffing the hard-packed dirt, each step deliberate and slow. The walk from his cabin took him the better part of an hour these days, or so he told anyone who bothered asking. The truth was different, but the truth had been buried so deep for so long that even he sometimes forgot where he'd left it. The trading post sat at the corner of Main and Pine, a sturdy building of rough-cut timber with a wide porch and windows that caught the last of the daylight. Sarah Crawford ran the place had for near about 12 years now, ever since her husband died and left her with a business to manage and a grandson to raise. She stood behind the counter when old Samuel pushed through the door, the bell above jangling, soft and tired. "Mr. Crane," she said, her voice carrying that careful politeness people use with folks they're not quite sure about. "What can I do for you today?" Old Samuel shuffled forward, his good eyes scanning the shelves while his clouded eyes stared at nothing. His hand, gnarled and spotted with age, trembled slightly as he reached into his coat pocket. "Need some ammunition, Miss Sarah. 30 caliber if you got it." Sarah pulled a box from under the counter, setting it down gentle. Her eyes lingered on his hands, on the way they shook when he reached for the box. But then something flickered across her face, gone almost before it appeared. A question, a memory, something that didn't quite add up. "Lot of ammunition for an old trapper," she said, keeping her tone light. Old Samuel's mouth twitched beneath his beard, might have been a smile. "Varmints don't care how old you are, ma'am. Still got to eat." "I suppose that's true." She watched as he counted out coins with those trembling fingers, placing them one by one on the scarred wood of the counter. Slow, deliberate, like a man who'd practiced being old until it felt almost real. The door banged open and 4 men walked in, their boots heavy on the floorboards, their voices loud with whiskey and the kind of confidence that comes from being young and armed. Mountain men by the look of them. Fur traders or trappers dressed in buckskin and wool, rifles slung over their shoulders and knives on their belts. They moved with the easy swagger of men who'd never been told no and didn't expect to start hearing it now. The one in front was younger than the others, maybe 26 or 27, with dark hair and a clean-shaven face that still had the smoothness of youth. He wore his gun low on his hip, tied down in the way of men who cared more about speed than sense, and his eyes held that bright, restless hunger that old Samuel recognized from a long time ago. The hunger of a man trying to prove something. "Well, hell," the young man said, his voice carrying across the trading post like he owned the place. "Look at this old cripple crawling around." The other 3 laughed, the sound sharp and mean. Old Samuel didn't look up, just kept counting his coins, his trembling fingers making the task take longer than it should. One of the men, thick around the middle with a scar running down his cheek, stepped closer. "You deaf old man, Caleb's talking to you." So the young one was Caleb. Old Samuel filed that away in the part of his mind that still worked like it used to, still catalog threats and calculated distances and remembered names that might matter later. He looked up slow, his clouded eye wandering his good eye, meeting Caleb's gaze for just a moment before dropping away, submissive, harmless. "Beg pardon," old Samuel said, his voice cracked and thin. "Didn't mean no disrespect." Caleb stepped forward, boots loud on the floor until he was standing right in front of the counter, close enough that old Samuel could smell the whiskey on his breath and the pine smoke in his clothes. "And where you headed, old man cemetery? Because you look about ready for it." The men behind him laughed again, harder this time. Sarah's jaw tightened, her hand moving to something under the counter, but she didn't speak. This was the kind of trouble that words only made worse. Old Samuel gathered up his box of ammunition, tucking it under one arm, and turned to shuffle toward the door. His walking stick scraped against the floor, his bad leg dragging everything about him, screaming weakness and age and no threat to anyone. But Caleb moved faster, stepping into his path, blocking the door. "I didn't say you could leave." Old Samuel stopped, his shoulders hunched, his head bowed. "Please, mister, don't want no trouble." "Then you shouldn't have been born looking like trouble." Caleb reached out and shoved, not hard, just enough to send the old man stumbling backward. The walking stick clattered to the floor. The box of ammunition fell, cartridges scattering across the floorboards like seeds scattered on bad ground. Old Samuel went down, catching himself on one knee, his breathing labored. From the floor, he looked even smaller, even older, even less of a threat. Just an old man who'd fallen and couldn't get back up without help. His hands fumbled for the walking stick, trembling worse now, and one of the scattered cartridges rolled near his fingers. "Caleb, leave him be." Sarah's voice cut through the laughter, hard and cold. "He's just an old man." Caleb glanced at her, his smile sharp. "Mind your business, woman, unless you want some too." But Sarah Crawford had been running this trading post through range wars and hard winters and men meaner than Caleb Frost, and she didn't scare easy. She pulled a shotgun from under the counter, not pointing it at anyone, just laying it on the wood where everyone could see it. "This is my business, and I'm telling you to leave him be." For a moment, the air went tight. The other three men shifted hands, drifting toward their guns, reading the situation, calculating whether this was worth the trouble. Caleb's jaw worked, his eyes moving from Sarah to the shotgun to old Samuel still on the floor, and something flickered across his face. Not fear, not quite, but recognition of a line he probably shouldn't cross. Then he laughed. Bright, sharp, cruel. The sound of a man who'd found something amusing in all this, who'd decided to let it go because it was funnier that way. That laugh. Old Samuel froze completely, his hands still reaching for the walking stick, but suddenly motionless, like he'd been turned to stone. That laugh. He'd heard it before 32 years ago, echoing across snow and pine, and the smell of blood freezing in the cold. A different voice, a different man, but the same bright cruelty, the same careless amusement at someone else's pain. The walking stick was in his hand before he realized he'd grabbed it. He stood, and for just a second, just a fraction of a heartbeat, there was no limp, no trembling, just smooth, controlled movement, the kind of balance that came from decades of moving through mountains and forests, where one wrong step meant death. His shoulders squared, his spine straightened. The clouded eye didn't matter because the good eye was suddenly locked on Caleb with the kind of focus that could put a bullet through a playing card at 50 paces. Then old Samuel caught himself. The limp came back. The trembling returned. The hunched shoulders, the bowed head, the helpless old man axe sliding back into place like a coat he'd worn so long it fit without thinking. But Caleb had seen it. That 1 second. That slip. The young man's laughter died. His eyes narrowed, studying the old man more carefully now, seeing something that didn't quite match. "You move fast for a cripple." "Lucky catch," old Samuel mumbled, fumbling with the walking stick, making it look awkward again. "Just lucky." But Caleb stepped closer, his head tilted, looking at the old man's face beneath the beard, at the way his shoulders wanted to stay square, even when he forced them down, at the hands that held the walking stick, with a grip that was too sure, too practiced. "You know what, old man? You remind me of someone, a ghost my pa told me about." Old Samuel didn't respond, just started gathering the scattered ammunition, his movements slow and shaking. Eli the Ghost. Caleb said the name hanging in the air like smoke. Fastest shot in the Rockies. Dead 30 years now or so, they say. But you know how it is with ghosts. Sometimes they don't stay buried. The old man's hand paused for just a moment on one of the cartridges, then continued its trembling collection. Don't know nothing about ghosts, mister. I'm just an old trapper trying to get by. Caleb stared at him for a long moment, then smiled again. But this time it was different, thoughtful. Like he'd found a puzzle he wanted to solve. Sure you are. He turned to his men. Come on, let's get a drink. Old man's not worth our time. They left boots heavy on the porch, voices fading as they headed toward the saloon across the street. The bell above the door jangled one more time, then went quiet. Sarah came around the counter, kneeling beside old Samuel, helping him gather the ammunition, her eyes searching his face. Who are you really? She asked, her voice low enough that nobody outside could hear. Old Samuel didn't answer, just picked up the last of the cartridges and placed them carefully back in the box. His hands were steady now, no trembling, no weakness, just the sure, efficient movements of a man who'd done this 1,000 times before. Then he seemed to remember himself, and the shake came back deliberate and practiced. I'm nobody, Miss Sarah. Just an old man trying to live out his days in peace. No. She stood arms crossed, looking down at him with eyes that had seen too much to be fooled. My father was William Crawford. You saved his life in 1854. Pulled him out of a river after his horse threw him. He described you to me before he died. Described Eli Thorne. The name fell between them like a stone into still water. Old Samuel stood slowly, his face hidden in shadow, his good eye meeting hers for the first time without pretense. For a moment, the old man was gone, and what stood in his place was something harder, sharper, carved from years of survival and loss. Your father was a good man, he said quietly, and his voice was different now, deeper without the crack and weakness. But Eli Thorne died a long time ago, Sarah. What's left is just Samuel Crane. Then why do I feel like I'm looking at a dead man walking? He turned away, gathering his things, the limp returning as he moved toward the door. Because that's exactly what you're seeing, ma'am. A dead man. Been dead for 32 years. Just took this long for my body to figure it out. He left the door swinging shut behind him, and Sarah stood alone in her trading post, watching through the window as the old man shuffled down the street toward the edge of town, toward the mountains beyond, toward whatever cabin or cave or forgotten place he called home. The sun had set completely now, leaving only the deep blue of twilight, and in that fading light, old Samuel Crane looked exactly like what he claimed to be. Just an old man. But Sarah Crawford had seen that moment when the mask slipped, and she knew better. 3 days later, in the small cabin that sat alone in a clearing 3 miles from town, Eli Thorne sat by the fire and told the truth to the only person who'd asked for it. Tom Crawford was 17 years old, tall and lean, with his grandmother's dark eyes and his grandfather's stubborn jaw. He sat across the fire from Eli, a bandage wrapped around his ribs, where a bullet had grazed him during the trouble that was still 3 days away, but somehow already felt like ancient history. The boy's hands shook slightly, not from pain, but from the weight of everything he'd learned, everything he'd seen. So it's true then, Tom said, his voice quiet. You really are Eli the Ghost. Eli looked into the fire, watching the flames dance and shift, seeing shapes in them that might have been memories or might have been nothing at all. His rifle rested against the wall nearby, within easy reach, the way it always was, always had been, even when he tried to forget how to reach for it. I was, Eli said, long time ago, before your grandfather was born, before this town existed, back when the mountains were still warm and men were wilder. Grandmother said you need to tell me everything, said I earned the right to know after what happened. Eli smiled, but there was no joy in it. Your grandmother's a wise woman, stubborn like her father, but wise. He reached for his coffee, taking a long drink, using the time to organize thoughts he'd kept buried for 3 decades. All right, boy, you asked for the story. Let me tell you why some stories should stay buried and what happens when someone digs them up anyway. The fire crackled. Outside, the wind moved through the pines with a sound like distant voices, and Eli Thorne began to speak, his voice steady and low, telling the story he had never told anyone. The story that started 5 days earlier when Caleb Frost walked into Sarah's trading post and saw through the disguise that had kept Eli alive and hidden for longer than most men lived at all. But to understand that day, Tom needed to understand the days before it, the years, the decades, the weight of a promise made to a dying woman and kept through sheer stubbornness, and the kind of fear that has nothing to do with death and everything to do with becoming the thing you hate most. It started, Eli said, in 1852. I was 33 years old and I'd already killed 23 men. Tom's eyes widened, but he didn't interrupt. Eli appreciated that. The boy knew when to listen. I wasn't proud of it, wasn't ashamed either. Killing was just something I did, like tracking or hunting or surviving. The mountains don't care about your morals, boy. They care if you're strong enough to live in them. I was strong, I was fast, and I was empty. The fire popped, sending sparks up into the darkness of the cabin's rafters. Eli watched them rise and fade like souls ascending or falling, depending on your theology. I met her on the Oregon Trail, Rose. She was 30 years old, a widow heading west with a wagon train, looking for a new life after her first husband died of consumption back in Missouri. The train got hit by Blackfoot raiders 2 days out from Fort Laramie. Most of the men scattered. I happened to be nearby hunting elk. Heard the gunfire. Tom leaned forward, the story pulling him in despite the pain in his ribs. I killed 4 of them before the others ran. Saved the train. Rose was the one who invited me to eat with them that night. Everyone else was too scared of me, but not her. She looked me in the eye and said, "A man who saves lives can't be as bad as they say he is." That was the first time in 15 years anyone had looked at me and seen something other than a killer. Eli's voice went soft, almost lost in the sound of the fire. I followed that wagon train all the way to Oregon. Told myself I was just making sure they got there safe. Truth was, I couldn't leave her. Something about the way she talked, the way she saw the world, made me feel like maybe I could be something other than what I'd become. 6 months later, we were married. "Did you love her?" Tom asked. "More than I loved living," Eli said simply. We built a cabin in Montana up in the high country where the streams ran clear and the deer were plentiful. I stopped gunfighting, started trapping, hunting, legally trading furs for supplies. Rose couldn't have children, something about the fever she'd had as a girl, but that was all right. We had each other. That was enough. The wind outside picked up, rattling the shutters. Eli stood and walked to the window, looking out into the darkness where the mountains rose like the walls of the world. For 4 years I was happy, really truly happy. I thought I'd left the ghost behind. Thought I could just be Eli Thorne, husband and trapper, living quiet and peaceful until I got old and died in my sleep like regular folks. But the past doesn't let go that easy, Tom. It waits, it watches, and when you least expect it, it comes back with a knife in its hand and a smile on its face. "What happened?" Tom's voice was barely a whisper. Eli turned back to the fire, his face half in shadow, half in light. "Silas Blackwood happened." The name hung in the air like a curse. Eli sat back down, his movements slow, not from age, but from the weight of memory pressing down on him. Silas was a mountain man, same as me. Trapper-trader, occasional enforcer for whoever paid him enough. We'd crossed paths a few times over the years, never friendly, never enemies. Just 2 men trying to survive in the same territory. But in 1841, I killed his son. Tom sucked in a breath. "Why?" "Marcus Blackwood drew on me in a poker game in Abilene, accused me of cheating, which I wasn't. I tried to walk away. He wouldn't let me. So I shot him. Clean, fast. He was dead before he hit the floor. Witnesses said it was a fair fight. The law agreed. But Silas didn't care about fair. He cared about blood." Eli stared into the flames, seeing that moment again. The cards on the table, Marcus's hand moving toward his gun. The decision that took less than a heartbeat, but echoed for decades. I knew he'd come for me eventually. But years passed. Tom had been 10, 15. I started to think maybe he'd let it go, or died, or forgotten. I should have known better. Men like Silas don't forget. They wait, they plan, and they make sure when they strike, it hurts worse than any bullet. The cabin was cold despite the fire. Tom pulled his coat tighter, but Eli didn't seem to notice the temperature. He was somewhere else now, somewhere colder, where the wind cut like broken glass and the snow turned red. Winter of 1857, I'd gone up into the high country to check my trap lines, got caught by a snowstorm that lasted 3 days. When I finally made it back to the cabin, I saw smoke, not from the chimney, from the walls, the roof, everything burning. Eli's voice went flat empty, the way it might sound if all the emotion had been burned out of it and only ash remained. Rose was on the porch, shot in the chest. The snow around her was red melted from the warmth of her blood, and it looked like roses. Red roses blooming in white snow. That's what I thought when I saw her. Roses. Tom made a small sound, might have been sympathy or horror or both. She was still alive when I got to her. Barely. Her lips were moving, trying to say something. I held her, and I knew I was supposed to tell her everything would be all right, that I'd get help, that she'd be fine. But I couldn't lie to her, not Rose, so I just held her while she died. The fire crackled, and somewhere in the forest, an owl called lonely and mournful. Her last words were, "Don't become the ghost again." She knew I'd want revenge, knew I'd want to hunt Silas down and put a bullet in him for every breath she'd taken. And she was begging me not to, begging me to let her death mean something other than more killing. "Promise me you'll live, Eli. Not just survive. Live." "And you promised," Tom said softly. "And I promised." Eli nodded. "I heard him, Silas. After she died, after I'd knelt there in the snow until my knees went numb and the blood froze on my hands. I heard him up on the ridge riding away, and he laughed, just like his boy Caleb laughed in that trading post, bright and cruel and pleased with himself. That's for Marcus Thorne. Now you know how it feels." Eli's hand moved to his belt where his gun usually sat but found nothing. He'd stopped wearing it decades ago, stopped even keeping it close except when absolutely necessary. The habit was still there, though, the instinct. I could have shot him. I was close enough, had my rifle right there, but my hands were shaking too bad and my eyes were too full of tears, and more than that, I just promised Rose I wouldn't become the ghost again. So I let him right away. I buried Rose under the pine tree she loved, marked her grave with a stone I carved myself, and then I disappeared. "For 32 years, Tom said. For 32 years. I grew my hair, long, grew a beard, practiced walking with a limp until it felt natural. Found this old cabin, lived like a hermit, told anyone who asked that my name was Samuel Crane and I was just an old trapper who'd lived too long and seen too much. And it worked. Nobody looked at me twice. Nobody wondered. Nobody cared. I'd buried Eli the ghost so deep that even I started to forget he'd ever existed. Until Caleb. Until Caleb." Eli's jaw tightened. That laugh. When he laughed in the trading post, it was like hearing Silas all over again. Like the past 32 years had been erased, and I was back in the snow with Rose's blood on my hands. And I realized something, Tom. I realized I'd been lying to myself. About what? About why I'd hidden. I told myself it was to keep my promise to Rose to live instead of seeking revenge. But the truth was simpler and uglier. I was afraid that if I went after Silas, I'd become the ghost again, afraid I'd find out I liked it, afraid I'd put a bullet in him and feel nothing at all. And that would mean Rose died for nothing, because I was always going to be a killer, no matter how hard I tried not to be. The fire was dying down the embers, glowing red like eyes in the darkness. Eli added another log, taking his time organizing his thoughts for what came next. "So that's the story up until 5 days ago. That's why I'm here. Why I've been hiding, why your grandmother looked at me and knew I was lying. Because I've been lying so long, I forgot what the truth felt like." "And then," Tom prompted, "and then everything changed." Eli settled back in his chair, the firelight painting shadows across his weathered face. The next morning, Caleb came back. He paused, and in that pause, the weight of what was still to come hung heavy in the air between them. The fire crackled, the wind moaned, and somewhere in the darkness beyond the cabin walls, the mountains kept their secrets a little while longer. But not forever. Never forever. The morning after Caleb Frost's first encounter with the old man, who wasn't quite what he seemed, the sky over Timber Ridge hung low and gray, pregnant with the promise of snow that wouldn't come for another month, but could already be felt in the cold bite of the wind. Tom Crawford had arrived at Eli's cabin just after dawn, his horse lathered and breathing hard, his face pale with the kind of fear that comes from carrying bad news. "Mr. Crane," he'd said, still using the false name because the truth hadn't fully settled in yet. Caleb Frost is looking for you, says he knows who you are. Eli had been sitting on his porch working an old piece of leather into a new pair of moccasins, his hands moving with the kind of steady precision that should have been impossible for someone his age. He didn't look up when Tom spoke, just kept his needle moving in and out, the rhythm unchanged. Does he now? It wasn't a question. Tom dismounted, tying his horse to the rail that Eli never used because he hadn't owned a horse in 3 decades, hadn't needed one when you only traveled 3 miles to town and back, and wanted everyone to think you were too old and poor to afford one anyway. He's gathered his men, 4 of them all armed. They're asking around town about Eli the ghost, about whether anyone's seen him, whether anyone knows where he might be hiding. And what did folks tell him? Nothing. Most people don't even remember the name. But Mr. Frost, he's persistent. He went to the library, pulled out old newspapers from the 50s, found stories about you, about the gunfights, the speed, the bodies left behind. Eli's needle paused for just a moment and then continued. The library. Clever boy. Most folks wouldn't think to look in books. There's more. Tom's voice dropped lower, and Eli finally looked up, his good eye sharp and assessing. He says you killed his kin 30 years back. Says you're Eli the ghost, and he's going to prove it. His kin. Eli set down the leather, the moccasin half finished, and stood slowly, his body moving with that careful deliberation that might have been age or might have been a man thinking through every motion before he made it. Did he say which kin? No, sir, just that you killed him, and he aims to make you pay. Eli walked to the edge of the porch, looking out over the clearing, toward the mountains beyond the peaks already dusted with early snow that gleamed white against the gray sky. Somewhere up there, buried under a pine tree that had grown thick and strong over 3 decades, Rose lay in the ground with a stone marker and a promise that Eli had kept through sheer stubbornness and fear. Tell me something, Tom. Why did you ride all the way out here to warn me you don't know me? For all you know, I am just some old hermit who's got nothing to do with ghosts or gunfights or anything else. Tom shifted his weight, uncomfortable with the question, but determined to answer it honest. Because grandmother told me to. She said if Caleb's looking for Eli Thorne, then Eli Thorne needs to know. And she said you saved my grandfather's life once, which means we owe you. Crawfords pay their debts. Your grandfather was a good man, Eli said quietly. Pulled him out of a river when his horse threw him during a spring flood. Wasn't anything special, just happened to be nearby. Any decent person would have done the same. But you did it, and that means something. Eli looked at the boy, really looked at him, and saw something in Tom's face that reminded him of himself at that age. The stubborn set of the jaw, the determination in the eyes, the absolute certainty that the world was black and white, right and wrong with clear lines between them. It would take years and blood and loss to teach him different, and Eli hoped the boy never had to learn those lessons the hard way. All right, Eli said, I appreciate the warning. Now you should get back to town before your grandmother worries. That's it. You're just going to stay here and wait for him to find you. Didn't say that, just said you should go home. Tom opened his mouth to argue, then seemed to think better of it. He untied his horse, swung up into the saddle, and looked down at Eli with something like disappointment in his young face. I thought you'd be different. The stories made you sound like a hero. Stories lie, boy. Heroes are just people who lived long enough to have someone else tell their tale. Most of the time, we're just trying to survive and hoping we don't become monsters in the process. Tom rode away without another word, and Eli watched him go until the forest swallowed him, and there was nothing left but the sound of hoofbeats fading into distance and silence. Then Eli went back inside his cabin, closed the door, and sat down at the small table where he took his meals alone and had for longer than he cared to remember. From under the floorboard beneath his bed, he pulled out a wooden box. The lock had rusted shut years ago, but Eli had kept the key anyway, more out of habit than necessity. He pried the box open with a knife, the hinges protesting with a squeal that sounded like something dying, and looked at what he'd hidden away 3 decades past. 2 guns, both Colt .45 peacemakers, though one was older and showed the wear of hard use, while the other looked almost new, the metal still bright despite the years in darkness. Eli lifted the older one first, feeling the weight of it settle into his palm like it had never left, like his hand had been shaped specifically to hold this piece of iron and wood in purpose. 31 men had died looking down the barrel of this gun. 31 names he could recite in his sleep, 31 faces he saw sometimes when he closed his eyes. The other gun was different. Lighter somehow, though it weighed the same. The barrel had been engraved with words in Rose's careful script, words she'd paid a silversmith in town to etch into the metal before she'd given it to Eli as a gift for their 3rd anniversary. He'd never fired it, never even loaded it, just packed it away after she died because looking at it hurt too much. He read the engraving now, his lips moving silently around the words. For Eli, may you only draw this to save, never to avenge. Rose. She'd known, even then 3 months before Silas came and ended everything she'd known, that Eli's past would catch up to him eventually. She'd known he'd be tempted to become the ghost again. And she'd given him this gun as a reminder, as a choice. The old gun for revenge. The new gun for protection. 2 paths, 2 futures. Eli sat there for a long time, the guns resting on the table in front of him, while the morning light crept across the floor, and the cabin grew colder as the fire in the stove died down to embers. He was still sitting there when the sound of horses came up the trail, multiple riders moving fast, and he knew without looking that his time for deciding had just run out. But before we get to what happened next, before we talk about Caleb Frost and the confrontation that was coming, whether Eli wanted it or not, there's more you need to understand. More about how Eli became the ghost in the first place, and why the thought of picking up that gun again scared him more than dying ever could. Because Tom had asked the right question, even if he didn't know it yet. What turns a man into a legend, and more importantly, what does it cost him? The answer started 40 years earlier, when Eli was just a boy of 15, with no family and no future, and nothing to lose. His parents had died of cholera when he was 14, part of the epidemic that swept through the frontier settlements in the summer of 1833, taking whole families in a matter of days. Eli survived because he'd been out hunting when the sickness hit, and by the time he came back, his mother and father were already in the ground, and the cabin had been burned to stop the disease from spreading. He could have gone to town, could have found someone to take him in, could have tried to build a normal life doing normal work. But grief does strange things to young minds, and Eli's grief came out as anger. Anger at God for taking his parents. Anger at the world for being cruel and random and uncaring. Anger at himself for not being there, even though there was nothing he could have done. So instead of going to town, he went into the mountains. Took his father's rifle, his mother's old cookpot, and everything he could carry, and walked into the wilderness with the vague idea that he'd either survive or die, and either way would be fine. He survived. More than that, he learned to track game by the way the grass bent and the soil compressed, learned to read weather in the color of the sky and the behavior of birds, learned to shoot not just accurately, but instinctively, the way you learn to catch something thrown at you without thinking about it. The rifle became an extension of his arms, the trigger, pull as natural as breathing, and by the time he was 16, he could put a bullet through a pine cone at 100 yards, or drop a running deer with a shot that looked more like luck than skill, but never was. He also learned to be alone, not just physically alone, though he spent months at a time without seeing another human soul, but emotionally alone. He stopped feeling things the way normal people did. Joy became just the absence of pain. Sadness became just a fact to acknowledge and move past. Even fear, which had been his constant companion those first few months in the wilderness, gradually faded until it was just another piece of information to process and react to. By the time he was 18, he wasn't quite human anymore. Not in the way that mattered. He was functional, efficient, perfectly adapted to survival in an environment that killed most men within a year. But the part of him that connected to other people, that felt empathy or love or even basic companionship, had atrophied from disuse until it was barely there at all. That's when he killed his first man. 3 trappers had stumbled onto Eli's camp in the spring of 1836. They saw a young man alone with good furs and a fine rifle and figured he'd be easy pickings. They were wrong. Eli shot all 3 before they'd fully drawn their weapons, clean kills at close range, and felt absolutely nothing. No guilt, no triumph, no horror at having taken human lives. Just the same cool assessment he'd feel after dropping a deer. Threat eliminated. Move on. He took their supplies, buried their bodies in a ravine, and went back to his traps like nothing had happened. Word spread the way it always does in the territories. A young man living alone in the high country, Fast with a gun, cold as winter ice, dangerous. Within a year, other men started looking for him, some wanting to hire him as a guard or enforcer, others wanting to test themselves against the legend that was already growing. Eli accommodated both. He hired out when he needed money or supplies, taking jobs that required violence and not asking questions about whether the violence was justified. And when men came looking to prove they were faster, he proved they weren't. By the time he was 22, he'd killed 19 men and earned the name that would follow him for the rest of his life, Eli the Ghost. They called him that because he appeared without warning, did what needed doing, and vanished before anyone could really get a good look at him. Some said he could walk through walls. Others said he could disappear into shadows. The truth was simpler and sadder. He was just a man who'd learned to survive by becoming something less than human, and people made up stories to explain what they couldn't understand. Then came Marcus Blackwood. It was a nothing dispute, the kind that happened in every saloon and card game across the frontier. Eli was playing poker in Abilene, Kansas, sitting with 4 other men and winning steadily because he'd learned to read faces the way he read animal tracks. Marcus Blackwood, 19 years old and full of whiskey and pride, was losing badly. And when young men lose badly, they look for someone to blame. "You're cheating," Marcus said, his words slurred, but his eyes hard and mean. Nobody wins that consistent without cheating. Eli hadn't even looked up from his cards. "I'm not cheating, you're just bad at this." The other players had gone quiet, sensing what was coming, hands moving away from the table and toward their laps in case they needed to get clear fast. Marcus stood up his chair, scraping loud against the floor, and Eli knew with the cold certainty of long experience exactly what was about to happen. "I'm calling you a cheat and a liar," Marcus said, his hand hovering over his gun, "and I'm saying you need to apologize or back it up." Eli finally looked up, his eyes meeting Marcus's across the table, and in that moment he gave the boy a chance, a real chance. "Walk away, son. This doesn't have to end bad. The only one walking away dead is you." Marcus drew. He was young and angry and drunk, which meant he was slow, and his hands shook and the barrel wavered as it came up. Eli's draw was smooth and mechanical and perfect, the product of thousands of hours of practice and dozens of real situations where hesitation meant death. He fired once. The bullet took Marcus in the center of his chest, right through the heart, and the boy was dead before he hit the sawdust floor. The saloon went silent, except for the sound of Marcus's body settling and the faint whistle of wind through a window someone had left open. Eli holstered his gun, gathered his winnings, and started toward the door. That's when he saw Silas Blackwood standing at the bar, frozen with a whiskey glass halfway to his lips, staring at his dead son with an expression that Eli would remember for the rest of his life. Not rage, not yet, just shock. And underneath the shock, something that looked almost like relief, like Silas had always known his boy would die young and violent, and was almost grateful to have the waiting over with. Their eyes met. Eli nodded once, a gesture that meant nothing and everything. Acknowledgement. Regret maybe, though Eli wasn't sure he was capable of regret anymore. Then he left, and behind him Silas Blackwood knelt beside his dead son and began the long process of turning shock into hate. The law ruled it self-defense. Witnesses testified that Marcus drew first, that Eli had tried to de-escalate, that it was a clean fight by every standard that mattered, in a place where such things happen regularly. Eli left town that same night and didn't think about it again. That was his mistake, because Silas Blackwood thought about it every day for the next 15 years, thought about it while he raised his other sons, thought about it while he built his lumber business and his land holdings and his reputation as a man you didn't cross. Thought about it while he waited and planned and looked for the perfect moment to make Eli Thorne understand what it felt like to lose everything. He found that moment in the winter of 1857, when Eli was gone checking trap lines and Rose was alone in the cabin they'd built together. Silas rode up with a simple offer. Sell the land, take the money, leave Montana. Rose refused. She knew Eli would never run, would never let himself be pushed off land they'd worked and bled for, and she wasn't about to make that decision without him. Silas shot her. Not immediately. First he made her watch while he set fire to the cabin. Made her understand that everything she'd built was going to burn. Then while the flames climbed the walls and the roof began to collapse, He put a bullet in her chest and rode away laughing, knowing that Eli would come home to find his wife dead and his life destroyed, and would spend the rest of his days wondering if it had been worth it killing that boy in Abilene over a card game and hurt pride. Eli came home 3 days later, rode in through the snow following the smoke, and found exactly what Silas wanted him to find: his wife, his life, his reason for becoming something more than the ghost. All of it gone. He could have hunted Silas down, should have by every law of revenge and justice that governed the frontier. But Rose's last words had been a plea, and Eli had made a promise. And keeping that promise meant burying not just Rose, but also Eli the ghost. Meant becoming someone new, someone harmless, someone who couldn't hurt anyone because he'd removed himself so completely from the world that he might as well be dead. So he did. He became Samuel Crane. He hid. And he told himself it was about keeping his promise, about honoring Rose's memory, about choosing to live instead of seeking revenge. But the truth he was only now starting to face as he sat in his cabin with 2 guns on the table, and the sound of horses getting closer was simpler and uglier. He'd been afraid. Afraid that if he went after Silas, he'd discover that Rose had been wrong about him. That underneath the husband and the trapper and the man who'd tried so hard to be good, there was still nothing but the ghost. Cold, empty, incapable of feeling anything except the satisfaction of a clean kill. And if that was true, if Rose had died believing in a man who didn't actually exist, then her death meant nothing and his promise meant nothing, and the last 32 years had been nothing but a long, slow suicide of a man too cowardly to pull the trigger himself. The horses stopped outside. Eli heard boots on his porch, heavy and deliberate, and then a knock on his door that was really more of a pounding, the sound of men who expected to be answered immediately. "Old man," Caleb's voice came through the wood, bright with anticipation and cruelty, and that same laugh that had echoed across 32 years. "We need to talk." Eli looked at the guns on his table. The old one stained with the blood of 31 men. The new one clean and never fired Rose's last gift and final wish. Two choices, two futures. He picked up the new gun, checked the cylinder out of habit, even though he knew it was empty, and began loading it with bullets he'd kept oiled and ready for 3 decades just in case. Not because, he'd expected to need them. Because a part of him had always known this day would come, and when it did, he'd have to choose who he wanted to be. The ghost, or the man Rose had believed in. He stood strapped the gun belt around his waist for the first time since 1857 and felt the weight of it settle against his hip like an old friend he'd hoped never to see again. Then he walked to the door, pulled it open, and looked at Caleb Frost and his 4 men with eyes that were no longer clouded or weak or old. "You wanted to talk," Eli said, his voice clear and hard, and nothing like the trembling old man who'd shuffled through town yesterday. "So talk." Caleb stared at him, and for just a moment, something like fear flickered across his young face, because the man standing in the doorway wasn't old Samuel Crane anymore. The disguise had been stripped away deliberately and completely, and what remained was something harder and sharper and infinitely more dangerous. Eli the ghost had come back, and Caleb Frost was about to learn why legends are legends and why some men should never be pushed. "My father sends his regards," Caleb said, trying to recover his swagger and almost succeeding. "Silas Blackwood. He's been looking for you for 20 years, and now he's found you." The name hit Eli like a physical blow, but he didn't let it show. "Silas Blackwood is dead. Died in a range war in '68. That's what he wanted people to think. Caleb smiled, and it was his father's smile, cruel and pleased. "He's very much alive, and he's coming here. Should arrive tomorrow at sunset. Says he's got 32 years of patience saved up, and he's going to spend all of it making you suffer before he kills you." Eli's hand didn't move toward his gun. Didn't need to. The threat was there in his stance, in his eyes, in the way he'd gone completely still. "Why are you here, boy? If Silas is coming, why send you ahead? To make sure you don't run, to make sure you're still here when he arrives, and to deliver a message." "What message?" Caleb pulled a piece of paper from his coat, unfolded it, and began to read. "Eli Thorne, I know where you've been. I've known since 1870. Watched you hide like a coward for 19 years. Watched you pretend to be someone else. Watched you live in fear every day, wondering if today's the day I come for you. That fear, that's my revenge. That's what you did to me when you killed Marcus. You made me live in pain. So I made you live in fear. But now the fear's over. Now comes the pain. See you tomorrow. Silas Blackwood. The words fell into silence. Eli stood in his doorway, processing the information, understanding with a sinking certainty that Silas hadn't just known where he was. Silas had been torturing him for 19 years, letting him think he was safe while knowing he could end it anytime he wanted. The cruelty of it was almost artistic. He wants you in town, Caleb continued. Tomorrow at sunset, Main Street. You don't show, he burns Timber Ridge to the ground and everyone in it. You do show and he might let them live. Might. Depends on his mood. And you can, Eli asked quietly. What do you get out of this? I get to watch you die, get to see the great Eli the ghost put down like the old dog he is. My pa's been telling me stories about you my whole life, about how fast you were, how dangerous, how you killed Marcus over nothing but pride. I want to see if the stories are true. Eli looked at Caleb, really looked at him, and saw a young man who'd been poisoned by his father's hate, who'd grown up on stories of revenge and glory, and never learned that both were lies that got men killed. He saw himself at that age empty and cold and certain that violence was the answer to everything. Your father lied to you, Eli said. Marcus drew first. It was a fair fight. My father doesn't lie. Then ask him tomorrow. Ask him if Marcus was drunk and stupid and looking for a fight. Ask him if I tried to walk away. Ask him if every witness testified it was self-defense. And then ask yourself why he waited 32 years to come for me if it was really about justice. Caleb's jaw worked, anger and doubt warring across his face. Doesn't matter. You still killed him. I did, and I've regretted it every day since. Not because I did anything wrong, but because your father made an innocent woman pay for it. Rose never hurt anyone in her life. She was kind and good and everything the frontier tries to grind out of people. And Silas shot her to hurt me. That's the man you're riding with, boy. That's the man you think doesn't lie. For a moment, something flickered in Caleb's eyes. Doubt, understanding, the beginning of a question he didn't want to ask. Then his face hardened again, and Eli knew he'd lost him. Caleb had been raised on hate too long to let it go now, not without something breaking first. Sunset tomorrow, Caleb said. Don't be late. They left horses kicking up dust as they rode back toward town, and Eli stood in his doorway watching them go until they disappeared into the trees. Then he went back inside, sat down at his table, and looked at the guns he'd thought he'd never have to touch again. From under the floorboard, he pulled out one more thing. A letter sealed with wax that had cracked and yellowed with age, addressed to him in Rose's careful handwriting. She'd given it to him 3 months before she died, made him promise not to open it unless something happened to her. He'd kept that promise for 32 years, kept it sealed and hidden, because opening it would mean accepting that she was really gone. Now with Silas coming and a choice to make and time running out, he broke the seal and read what his wife had written to him from beyond the grave. The words blurred as tears filled his eyes for the first time in decades, and by the time he finished reading, he knew exactly what he had to do. Not what the ghost would do, not what vengeance demanded, but what Rose had asked of him in her final gift, her final plea, her final act of faith in the man she'd married and loved and died believing in. He had to choose, and the choice had to be his alone. Outside, the sun moved toward the horizon, counting down the hours until sunset tomorrow, until Silas Blackwood rode into Timber Ridge looking for blood and pain and the satisfaction of 32 years of carefully cultivated hate. And Eli Thorne, once known as the Ghost, sat in his cabin and prepared for a reckoning that had been building since a card game in Abilene, and a bullet through a young man's heart in all the choices, good and bad, that had followed. The story was coming to its end. One way or another, by tomorrow night, the ghost would be buried for good. The only question was whether Eli Thorne would be buried with him or whether Rose had been right all along about who he really was underneath the legend. He'd find out soon enough, they all would. The letter from Rose had been brief, written in her careful hand on paper she'd saved for important things, the kind of paper that cost money they didn't have, but she'd bought anyway because some words deserved to be preserved. Eli read it 3 times in the fading light of his cabin, each reading revealing something new, some layer of meaning he'd missed the first time through. My dearest Eli, it began, And just those 3 words were enough to break something inside him that had been holding for 32 years. If you're reading this, I'm gone. Silas came while you were away just like I knew he would. Don't blame yourself. You couldn't have known, couldn't have stopped it. Some things are just meant to happen and we can't change them no matter how hard we try. I'm not afraid. I know where I'm going. But I'm afraid for you, my love. Afraid you'll want revenge. Afraid you'll pick up that gun and become the ghost again, and this time there won't be anyone to bring you back. So I'm asking you, begging you, please don't. Don't let my death turn you into the thing you spent 4 years learning not to be. Don't give Silas that victory. Promise me you'll live. Not just survive, not just exist, but really live. Find peace. Find purpose. Find a way to make my death mean something other than more killing. If you must fight, fight to protect, not to punish. There's a difference and you know it. The ghost fought to punish. Eli Thorne fights to protect. Be Eli, please. I'll wait for you in heaven. But take your time getting here. Live a full life first. Love again if you can. Help people if you're able. Be the man I saw in you, not the man you're afraid you are. All my love forever and always, Rose. P.S. Under the floorboard where we hid our savings, there's a second gun. I bought it for you last month, had it engraved. Use it wisely. Use it well. Use it to save, never to avenge. Eli folded the letter carefully, his hands trembling not from age but from emotion, too long suppressed, and placed it in his shirt pocket over his heart. Then he went to the floorboard, the one he'd already opened, to get the guns, and looked more carefully at what else was hidden there. Behind the wrapped bundle of bills they'd saved for emergencies, behind the small leather pouch of Rose's jewelry, there was another gun he hadn't noticed in his initial search. The Colt looked new, untouched, the metal bright and clean. He lifted it out, and in the lamplight, he could see the engraving on the barrel, words etched deep into the steel in Rose's flowing script. For Eli, may you only draw this to save, never to avenge. Rose. She'd known. Months before Silas came, she'd known that Eli's past would catch up to them, that violence would find them no matter how far they ran or how peaceful they tried to be. And she'd prepared for it the only way she knew how, by giving him a choice. By making it clear that even in death, even knowing what was coming, she believed he could be more than the ghost. She believed in Eli Thorne, the man, not the legend. He sat there until full dark, the 2 guns on the table in front of him, while outside the wind picked up and the temperature dropped, and somewhere in the distance, a wolf howled its loneliness to the uncaring stars. The old gun heavy with history and blood. The new gun bright with hope and faith. 2 paths forward. 2 versions of himself. By the time the sun rose the next morning, Eli had made his choice. The town meeting happened at midday in Sarah Crawford's trading post, the largest building in Timber Ridge that wasn't a saloon or a church. Word had spread fast, the way it always did in small towns, carried on worried whispers and fearful glances. And by the time Eli walked down Main Street at noon, it seemed like half the town had gathered to decide his fate. He'd shaved his beard that morning, revealing a face that was weathered and lined, but recognizably the same face that had stared out from wanted posters 40 years ago. He'd cut his hair short, washed the grime and pretense away, and dressed in clothes he'd kept hidden at the bottom of his trunk. The good clothes he'd worn when he married Rose, still serviceable, if a bit tight across the shoulders. He walked without the limp, his back straight, his head high, and every person who saw him understood immediately that old Samuel Crane had been a lie, and Eli Thorne was the truth. Sarah stood behind her counter when he entered, her face pale but determined, and Tom was beside her, one hand resting on a rifle that Eli hoped the boy wouldn't have to use. The rest of the town filled the trading post and spilled out onto the porch, merchants and farmers and their families, all of them looking at Eli with expressions that ranged from fear to awe to anger. Sheriff Henry Borden stood near the front, a man of 55 who'd been elected because he was fair and honest and not because he'd ever been particularly good with a gun. He cleared his throat, the sound loud in the tense silence, and addressed the crowd. "Folks, we all know why we're here. Caleb Frost says Silas Blackwood is coming to town at sunset looking for this man." He gestured to Eli. "Says if we don't hand him over, Silas will burn the town and everyone in it. Says if we do hand him over, Silas might leave us be. We need to decide what we're going to do." A man in the back shouted out, his voice tight with fear. We should give him up. Why should we all die for some stranger who's been lying to us for years? Another voice, a woman this time. He's not a stranger. He's been part of this town for near about 15 years. Never caused trouble. Never hurt anyone. That we know of, the first man shot back. But we've all heard the stories now. Eli the ghost, killer. Gunfighter. How many men did you kill, old man? How many widows did you make? Eli met the man's eyes, unflinching. 31 men, all of them in fair fights or self-defense. All of them because they drew on me first or hired me to protect something. I'm not proud of it, but I won't apologize for surviving. The trading post erupted in argument, voices talking over each other, some demanding Eli be handed over, others insisting they couldn't just sacrifice a man to save themselves. Sarah slammed her hand on the counter, the sound sharp as a gunshot, and the crowd quieted. My father was William Crawford, she said, her voice carrying clear and strong. Some of you knew him. Good man, honest, fair. He died in '69, and before he passed, he told me about Eli Thorne. Told me Eli saved his life when a flash flood nearly drowned him in '54. Told me Eli was the fastest gun he'd ever seen, but also the most reluctant to use it. Said Eli only killed when he had no choice and every death weighed on him. She pulled out a stack of old newspapers from under the counter, yellowed with age but still readable, and held them up for everyone to see. I've been doing some research since yesterday. Look at these. 1853, Eli Thorne stops a train robbery, saves 23 children. 1854, Eli Thorne pulls a drowning man from a river. 1855, Eli Thorne tracks down a gang that kidnapped a rancher's daughter, brings her back safe. These aren't the actions of a monster. These are the actions of a hero. A hero who killed 31 men, someone muttered. In a time and place where killing was sometimes the only option. Sarah fired back. How many of you have guns in your homes? How many of you would shoot a man who threatened your family? That's all Eli did. He survived. And now we're going to condemn him for it. The argument raged on back and forth, fear warring with conscience, self-preservation battling against basic human decency. Eli listened to it all in silence, letting them debate his worth, his life, his right to their protection. He'd expected no different. Fear made people selfish, and he couldn't blame them for wanting to live. Finally, Reverend Joshua Stone spoke up, his voice quiet, but carrying the weight of moral authority. The Bible says, "Thou shalt not kill." It also says, "Greater love hath no man than this, that a man lay down his life for his friends." We're being asked to choose between two commandments, between safety and righteousness. And I'll be honest, I don't know which one is right. He paused, looking at Eli with eyes that had seen too much suffering to judge easily. But I do know this. If we hand this man over to be killed, we become complicit in murder. And I don't think I can live with that on my conscience. So I say we'd let him make his own choice. Fight or flee, stay or go, and we support whatever he decides. The room went quiet, everyone looking at Eli now, waiting for him to speak, to tell them what he was going to do and whether they'd have to face Silas Blackwood's wrath for harboring him. Eli stepped forward into the space Sarah had cleared in front of the counter, and for the first time since he'd walked into the trading post, he smiled. It wasn't a happy smile, wasn't triumphant or confident, just tired. The smile of a man who'd carried a burden for too long and was finally ready to set it down. I'm going to face Silas, he said simply. Not because I want revenge, not because I'm looking to prove anything, but because if I run, he'll hurt you to get to me. And I've spent 32 years running from who I used to be. I'm done running. You'll die, Sheriff Borden said, and it wasn't a question. Maybe, probably. Silas was good with a gun even when we were young, and I haven't drawn on a man in 3 decades. But at least I'll die as myself, as Eli Thorne, not as some scared old man hiding from his past. Tom Crawford pushed forward through the crowd, his young face set with determination. Then I'm standing with you. You saved my grandfather. You've been good to this town. I won't let you face him alone. No, Eli's voice was firm, leaving no room for argument. This is my fight, Tom, my past, my reckoning. You're a good boy, and you'll make a fine man, but you're not dying for me. Then what am I supposed to do? Just watch. Eli looked at the boy, seeing in him all the potential that could be wasted by a single bullet, all the life that shouldn't be cut short by an old man's mistakes. I want you to learn from this. Watch what happens when violence breeds violence, when revenge becomes more important than living. And I want you to promise me something. What? That you'll never become the ghost. Never let anger or hurt or pride turn you into something cold and empty. There are men in this world who need killing that won't lie to you about that. But most problems can be solved without bullets if you're smart enough and patient enough. Be smart. Be patient. Be better than I was. The meeting broke up soon after people drifting away to their homes and businesses, some stopping to shake Eli's hand or wish him luck, others avoiding his eyes and hurrying past like they were afraid his fate might be contagious. Sarah stayed behind, and when the trading post was empty except for her and Tom and Eli, she poured 3 glasses of whiskey and handed them around. To bad decisions and good intentions, she said, raising her glass. They drank and the whiskey burned, going down sharp and real and alive in a way that Eli hadn't felt in years. When the glasses were empty, Sarah refilled them and they drank again. And this time the burn was less and the warmth was more. And for a few minutes it was almost like being young again when the future was open and anything seemed possible. There's something you should know, Sarah said, finally setting down her glass. Caleb mentioned his father, Silas Blackwood, but he didn't mention his brothers. Eli looked up sharply. Brothers. Silas had 3 sons, Marcus, who you killed, and 2 others. The oldest died in a range war in '62. The middle one died in a mining accident in '67. Caleb's the last one left, the baby of the family. And from what I hear, Silas raised him on stories of you, made you into the monster that killed his brother and destroyed his family. So Caleb doesn't know the truth about Marcus. I doubt it. Silas probably told him some version where you were the villain and Marcus was the innocent victim. That's how hate works. It needs a story, and the story doesn't have to be true, it just has to be believed. Eli nodded slowly, understanding clicking into place. Caleb wasn't evil, wasn't even particularly bad. He was just a young man who'd been poisoned by his father's bitterness, fed a diet of revenge and glory, until he couldn't tell the difference between justice and murder. Eli had been that young man once, empty and cold and convinced that violence was the only answer. He knew how that story ended. I'm going to try to talk to him, Eli said, before Silas gets here. Maybe if I can make him see the truth, he won't have to deal for his father's hate. And if you can't, then I'll do what I have to do. But I'll try a mercy first. Rose would want that. Sarah reached under the counter and pulled out a vest, old but well-made, thick leather with brass buttons. This was my father's. He wore it when he rode with the territorial militia back in the '50s. Stopped a bullet once, saved his life. I want you to have it. Eli took the vest, feeling the weight of it, the history. I can't take this. You can and you will. My father would have wanted you to have it. Said you saved his life so his gear should protect yours. Fair trade. He put on the vest and it fit well enough, tight across the shoulders but serviceable. Tom watched him, eyes wide, seeing not old Samuel Crane, but the legend his grandmother had told him about the ghost made flesh, and standing in front of him preparing for a fight that might be his last. Mr. Thorne, Tom said quietly, are you scared? Eli considered the question, looking inward, at feelings he'd suppressed for so long, he'd almost forgotten how to name them. Yes, he said finally. I'm terrified, not of dying. I've made my peace with that, but of becoming the ghost again, of killing Silas and feeling nothing, of proving that Rose was wrong about me, that underneath everything, I'm still just empty. What if you're not? What if she was right? Then I'll find out today, one way or another. The afternoon crawled by like a wounded animal, slow and painful, while Eli prepared for what was coming. He cleaned both guns, oiling the mechanisms and checking the actions, making sure they'd fire when needed. He loaded Rose's gun, the one she'd given him, the one engraved with hope and faith, and strapped it to his right hip. The old gun, the killer's gun, he left on the table, loaded but not carried. If he needed a second weapon, it would be there. But he wanted his first choice to be mercy, not revenge. Tom stayed with him, watching and learning, asking questions that Eli answered as honestly as he could. How do you steady your hand when you're afraid? You don't. You learn to shoot through the fear. How do you know when to draw when there's no other choice left and every second you delay means death? How do you live with killing a man you don't? Not really. You just learn to carry the weight. As the sun began its slow descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and red like the world was on fire, Eli stood and checked his reflection in the small mirror Sarah had brought him. The face looking back was old-weathered, marked by 70 years of hard living and harder choices. But it was his face, not a disguise, not a lie. Just Eli Thorne, for better or worse, ready to face the consequences of decisions made 4 decades ago. "It's time," he said. They walked to Main Street together, Eli and Tom and Sarah, moving through a town that had gone quiet, intense, people watching from windows and doorways, but not coming out, not wanting to be associated with what was about to happen. The sun was maybe an hour from setting, casting long shadows across the dirt street, and at the far end near the saloon, Eli could see horses tied to the rail and men standing in a loose group waiting. Caleb Frost stepped forward when he saw Eli approach, his hand resting on his gun, his young face hard with determination and something else. Something that might have been doubt buried deep but present. Behind him, his 3 men fanned out, creating a semicircle of threat, but they didn't draw. Not yet. "Didn't think you'd show," Caleb said. "I gave my word, and I keep my promises." Brave or stupid, hard to tell which. Eli stopped about 20 feet away, far enough that drawing wouldn't be suicide, close enough that talking was still possible. "Caleb, there's something you need to know before your father gets here. About Marcus, about how he died." "I know how he died. You shot him over a card game." "That's true, but do you know why?" Caleb's jaw tightened. "Because you're a killer. Because that's what you do." "I shot him because he drew on me first. Because he was drunk and angry and convinced I was cheating when I wasn't. Because I tried to walk away and he wouldn't let me. It was self-defense, Caleb. Witnessed and testified to by everyone in that saloon. Your father knows this. He's known it for 40 years. But he never told you, did he?" Something flickered across Caleb's face there and gone too quick to name. "You're lying." "Am I?" "Ask him when he gets here. Ask him if Marcus drew first. Ask him if the law ruled it a fair fight. Ask him why he waited 32 years to come after me if it was really about justice and not just about making me suffer." "My father doesn't lie to me." "Maybe not, but he might not tell you the whole truth either. There's a difference." The sound of hoofbeats interrupted them, coming from the north road, multiple horses moving at a steady pace. Caleb turned his hand, dropping from his gun, and Eli felt his heart rate pick up, adrenaline flooding his system the way it used to before a fight, sharpening his senses in slowing time and making every detail crystal clear. 8 riders came into view, silhouetted against the setting sun, and even from a distance, Eli recognized the figure in the lead. Silas Blackwood sat his horse like he'd been born in the saddle, his posture straight despite his age, and even from 50 yards away, Eli could feel the weight of his attention, the focus of hate cultivated over decades. They rode into town and stopped in the middle of Main Street, spreading out in a line, and Silas dismounted slowly, taking his time, making everyone wait while he tied his horse and adjusted his gun belt, and finally turned to face Eli. 32 years had changed him. His hair had gone from black to silver, his face had been carved deeper by time and weather, and he moved with the careful deliberation of age. But his eyes were the same, cold, hard, absolutely certain of their righteousness. "Eli Thorne," Silas said, his voice carrying across the street. "Been a long time." "Not long enough." Silas smiled, and it was the smile Eli had heard in nightmares, the smile that had echoed in Caleb's laugh. "You've aged poorly. Hiding doesn't suit you. And murdering innocent women suited you. Rose wasn't innocent. She was an obstacle, a weakness, something you cared about, which meant something I could take away. You understand that, don't you? You took my son, so I took your wife. Fair trade." The words landed like physical blows, but Eli kept his face neutral, his hand away from his gun. "Marcus drew on me first. It was a fair fight. So everyone kept telling me, over and over, it was fair, Silas. It was legal, Silas. Your boy was drunk and stupid and got what he deserved. But you know what I heard underneath all those words? I heard that my son was worth less than a card game and a gambling debt. That his life didn't matter enough to even call it murder. That's not what I thought. I tried on to walk away. He wouldn't let me. You could have let him win, could have taken a beating, could have done anything except put a bullet through his heart. But you didn't. You killed him quick and clean and walked away like it was nothing. Like he was nothing. Eli had no answer for that. It was true. He'd killed Marcus efficiently and without hesitation, and at the time it had meant nothing to him beyond another threat, eliminated another day survived. The ghost had done what the ghost always did, and the consequences had seemed distant and unimportant. You're right, Eli said quietly. I killed your son and didn't feel a thing. Back then I was empty, hollow. The ghost wasn't just a name, it was what I'd become. And I'm sorry for that. Sorry I didn't feel what I should have felt. Sorry your boy died over something so stupid. Sorry Rose had to pay for my sins. Silas blinked surprise flickering across his face. You think an apology makes this right? No, nothing makes this right. But it's all I've got. I can't bring Marcus back. Can't undo Rose's death. Can't change the fact that I was a killer who didn't care who I killed as long as I survived. But I can tell you the truth. I can tell you that I've spent 32 years trying to be better than I was, trying to live up to the man Rose thought I could be. And I can tell you that killing me won't bring you peace. It'll just leave you empty, the same way killing Marcus left me empty until Rose taught me how to feel again. For a moment, just a heartbeat, something shifted in Silas's expression. Something that might have been recognition or regret, or the faint echo of the man he'd been before. Hate consumed him. Then it hardened again, and Eli knew he'd lost. Pretty words, Silas said, but words don't bring back the dead. Caleb, you know what to do. Caleb looked at his father, then at Eli. Conflict written clear across his young face. But what if he's telling the truth? What if Marcus really did draw first? He drew first, Silas said flatly. I've never denied that, but it doesn't matter. Fair fight or not, Eli killed him and someone has to pay. But you told me Eli was a murderer. You said he shot Marcus in the back over a card game. I simplified the story for you, made it easier to understand. You lied to me. Caleb's voice was rising, anger and betrayal mixing. You've been lying to me my whole life, filling my head with hate for a man who was just defending himself. I gave you purpose, direction, something to fight for. You gave me your revenge. You used me. Caleb's hand had moved to his gun, but not to draw on Eli. He was pointing it at his father, and the 8 men who'd ridden in with Silas shifted nervously, hands hovering near their weapons, unsure who was the enemy now. Silas looked at his son, and something in his face cracked. You're all I have left, boy. Marcus died. Your brothers died. Your mother died of heartbreak. You hoarded the last piece of my family, and I raised you to finish what needs finishing. What needs finishing is this cycle of killing. Eli was right. Revenge won't bring anyone back. It'll just make more widows and orphans and men consumed by hate. I won't be part of it. Caleb holstered his gun and stepped away from his father, walking to where Eli stood and stopping a few feet away. I'm sorry for everything, for believing the lies, for hunting you, for being part of this. Eli nodded, understanding and forgiveness mixed together. You're young. You've got time to be better than what you were raised to be. That's all any of us can hope for. Silas watched his last son walk away, watched the final piece of his revenge plan crumble, and something broke inside him that had been barely holding together. He drew his gun with a speed that belied his age, bringing it up and pointing it not at Eli but at Caleb. His face twisted with rage and loss and the realization that he'd destroyed his family with his own hands. If you won't kill him, I'll kill you both. He fired. Eli moved instinct and training and 32 years of suppressed muscle memory, all combining into one smooth motion. He drew Rose's gun, the one engraved with mercy and hope, and fired once. Not at Silas's chest, not for the kill, but at his gun hand the way he'd been trained to do when the goal was stopping rather than ending. The bullet took Silas in the wrist, shattering bone and tendon, and his gun spun away, clattering into the dirt. He staggered, grabbing his ruined hand, blood pouring between his fingers, and his face went white with shock and pain. Caleb stood frozen and untouched, the bullet that had been meant for him buried in the wall behind where he'd been standing. Eli had moved him, pushed him aside with one hand while drawing with the other, and the boy was only now realizing how close he'd come to death. The 8 men who'd ridden in with Silas, scattered mounting their horses and riding hard for the edge of town, wanting no part of whatever was happening here. In seconds, it was just Silas and Caleb and Eli standing in the middle of Main Street, while the sun touched the horizon and painted everything in shades of blood and fire. Eli walked forward slowly, his gun still in his hand, but pointed at the ground and looked down at Silas Blackwood, the man who'd killed his wife and stolen 32 years of his life and finally been stopped, not by revenge but by mercy. "I'm not going to kill you, Silas. Rose wouldn't want that. And more importantly, I don't want that. I spent too many years being the ghost empty and cold, and I won't go back to it. Not even for you." Silas looked up at him, his face pale blood dripping from his shattered wrist. "Then you're a fool. I'll heal. I'll come back. I'll kill everyone you've ever cared about until there's nothing left but you and me and the reckoning you're trying to avoid." "No, you won't." Sheriff Borden stepped forward, finally finding his courage, and pulled handcuffs from his belt. "Silas Blackwood, you're under arrest for murder, attempted murder, and threatening a town. You'll stand trial, and if there's any justice left in this world, you'll hang." He cuffed Silas, careful of the injured wrist, and 2 townsmen came forward to help support him as he swayed on his feet, shock and blood loss taking their toll. Silas looked at Eli one last time, and in his eyes was something Eli had never expected to see. Defeat. Not physical defeat, though that was there too, but spiritual defeat. The collapse of a man who'd built his entire life around hate and revenge and had just watched it all crumble to nothing because the object of his hate had chosen mercy over murder. "You should have killed me," Silas said quietly. "It would have been kinder." "Probably," Eli agreed. "But Rose didn't teach me to be kind. She taught me to be human. And humans don't always do the kind thing. Sometimes we do the right thing, even when it hurts." They took Silas away, and the crowd that had been watching from windows and doorways slowly emerged, talking in low voices, processing what they'd seen. Caleb stood alone, looking lost, until Eli put a hand on his shoulder. "What do I do now?" Caleb asked. "My father's going to prison or worse. My family's gone. I've got nothing. You've got a choice. Same choice I had when Rose died. You can let this destroy you, turn you bitter and empty and full of hate, or you can learn from it, be better than what you were raised to be, build something instead of tearing things down." "I don't know how." "Then I'll teach you, if you're willing to learn." Caleb looked at him, really looked, and saw not the ghost of legend, but an old man who'd chosen mercy when vengeance would have been easier, who'd kept a promise for 32 years because love mattered more than hate. "Why would you help me after everything?" "Because someone helped me once, and because you remind me of myself at your age, empty and angry and looking for purpose in all the wrong places. I can show you the right places if you'll let me." The trial happened 3 weeks later in the territorial courthouse with Judge Franklin Morrison presiding and half the territory watching. Silas Blackwood was convicted on all counts, the evidence overwhelming and the testimony damning. They sentenced him to hang, but something happened the night before the execution was scheduled. Silas took sick a fever that burned through him like wildfire, and by morning he was dead, his body consumed by infection from the wrist wound that had never properly healed. Some said it was justice. Others said it was mercy. Eli thought it was probably both the universe's way of ending a story that had gone on too long and hurt too many people. He attended the funeral, one of only 3 people there. Caleb stood by the grave, weeping for the father he'd loved despite everything, and Eli stood beside him in silent support. When it was over and the dirt had been shoveled in, and the marker placed, Caleb turned to Eli with red-rimmed eyes. "Thank you for being here, for not hating him the way he hated you. I did hate him for a long time, but hate's a heavy thing to carry, and I'm too old for heavy things now. Easier to let it go and remember that he was a father who loved his son even if he showed it in terrible ways." And they walked back to town together, Eli leaning more heavily on his walking stick than he had before the fight, feeling every one of his 70 years in his bones and joints. The wound in his shoulder from Caleb's wild first shot had healed, but it ached in cold weather, and the exertion of the showdown had taken a toll he wasn't sure he'd fully recover from. But he'd kept his promise. He'd faced Silas and survived. More than that, he'd faced himself and won. The ghost had whispered its temptations, had offered the cold comfort of empty efficiency, and Eli had said no, had chosen to be human instead of legend, had proven that Rose had been right about him all along. That night, he sat in his cabin with Tom Crawford teaching the boy to clean a rifle properly, and the conversation turned to the future. "What will you do now?" Tom asked. "Now that it's over." "Live," Eli said simply. "Really live like Rose wanted. I've spent 32 years hiding, and another 40 before that just surviving. Maybe it's time to actually enjoy what's left." "Will you stay in Timber Ridge?" "For a while, got some things to teach you still. Some wisdom to pass on if you'll have it." "I'd like that." They worked in comfortable silence for a while, the rifle slowly coming clean under Tom's careful attention. Outside, the wind moved through the pines, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote sang its lonely song to the moon. 5 years passed. The story of Eli Thorne and Silas Blackwood became legend told and retold in saloons and around campfires, growing with each telling until it bore only a passing resemblance to the truth. Some versions had Eli killing a dozen men in a lightning-fast draw. Others had him talking Silas down with nothing but words. The truth, as always, lay somewhere in the middle, but nobody seemed particularly interested in truth when legend was so much more satisfying. Timber Ridge grew. The railroad came through, bringing commerce and people and progress. What had been a rough mining town of 200 became a thriving community of over 1,000 with proper streets and gas lights and all the trappings of civilization pushing steadily westward. Caleb Frost stayed working first as Eli's apprentice and then as his partner, learning the mountains and the skills needed to survive them. He married a school teacher from back east, a woman named Elizabeth, who saw past his family's dark history to the good man he was trying to become. They had 3 children, and Caleb raised them with gentleness and love and strict instructions never to settle disputes with violence if words could do the job. Tom Crawford became deputy sheriff and then sheriff when Henry Borden retired, and under his watch, Timber Ridge became known as one of the safest towns in Montana Territory. He never killed a man in the line of duty, a record he was proud of. And when people asked how he managed it, he'd tell them about an old mountain man who'd taught him that the hardest choice was often the right choice. Sarah Crawford became mayor, the first woman to hold a position in the territory, and used her authority to push for schools and hospitals and all the institutions that turned a settlement into a home. She never married again, said once was enough, but she took in orphans and strays and anyone who needed help, and her trading post became the heart of the community, the place where problems got solved and futures got planned. And Eli grew old, really old, not the fake old he'd pretended for 32 years, but the genuine article with joints that ached in the morning and a back that protested steep hills and eyes that needed spectacles for reading. He moved into town, taking a small house near Sarah's trading post, and spent his days teaching the young ones about history and survival and the cost of violence. On a cool autumn afternoon in 1894, when Eli was 75 years old and his hair had gone from silver to white, and his hands had developed a tremor that had nothing to do with pretense, he took a walk up to the hill outside of town where they'd built the cemetery. The town had offered to move Rose's grave from the mountains to somewhere more accessible, but Eli had refused. She was buried where she'd wanted to be, under a pine tree with a view of the high country, and that's where she'd stay. But they'd erected a monument in the town cemetery anyway, a simple stone marker with both their names. Rose Thorne, 1822 to 1857, Eli Thorne, 1819 to whenever. The second date was blank, waiting. Eli stood in front of the marker, reading the inscription they'd added below the names. She saw the man, not the ghost, and he became the man she saw. Tom Crawford approached, walking quiet, and stood beside Eli in companionable silence. The boy was 22 now, grown into a man, and he carried himself with the confidence of someone who knew his place in the world and was comfortable with it. "Grandmother says you've been spending a lot of time up here lately," Tom said. "Getting old makes you contemplative. Start thinking about what's next, what's waiting on the other side." "You believe in that?" "The other side? I believe Rose is somewhere. Whether it's heaven or something else, I don't know, but I believe she's waiting, and I believe she'll have thoughts about how long I took getting there." Tom smiled. "She'd probably understand." "Maybe, or maybe she'd point out that I promised to live a full life, and 75 years is pretty full by any standard." They stood together watching the sunset over the mountains, painting the sky in those same shades of copper and fire that Eli had watched 1,000 times before. The town below was lighting its lamps, little points of warm light against the gathering darkness, and smoke rose from chimneys, carrying the smell of cooking and home, and life continuing the way it always did. "Do you ever regret it?" Tom asked, choosing mercy over revenge, letting Silas live as long as he did. Eli considered the question, turning it over in his mind the way he'd turned over many hard questions in his long life. "No," he said finally. "Rose was right. Violence only breeds violence. If I'd killed Silas, Caleb would have come after me, and the cycle would have continued until everyone involved was dead. By choosing mercy, I broke the cycle, gave Caleb a chance to be something other than his father's revenge. That's worth more than any satisfaction I'd have gotten from putting a bullet in Silas. Did it hurt letting him live? Every single day for 5 years, but some things are supposed to hurt. That's how you know they matter." A week later, Eli was giving lessons to a group of children in the schoolhouse, teaching them about plants and how to identify which ones were safe to eat and which ones would kill you. One of the students, a girl of maybe 8 years old, asked him if it was true he'd been the fastest gun in the West. "Once upon a time," Eli said, "long time ago. My pa says you killed 100 men. Your pa's exaggerating. It was 31 and every one of them still bothers me." "Why?" "Because killing someone, even when you have to, even when it's them, or you take something from you, a piece of your soul maybe, or your humanity. And if you do it enough times, there's nothing left but empty space where a person used to be. But you stopped. You got better." Eli smiled at her, this child who understood more than she probably should. "I did. Someone believed in me enough to help me remember how to be human again. And I'm trying to pass that forward, teach you kids to be better than I was, to find other ways to solve problems before resorting to violence. What if there is no other way? Then you do what you have to do, but you make sure, really sure, because once you pull that trigger, you can't take it back." The lesson continued, moving from philosophy to practical skills, and Eli watched the children learn and absorb and ask questions, and he felt something he hadn't felt in a very long time: pride. Not in himself, but in what he was building. A legacy that had nothing to do with how fast he could draw or how many men he'd killed, and everything to do with the knowledge and wisdom he could pass to the next generation. That evening, he sat on his porch with a cup of coffee, watching the town settle in for the night, and Sarah came by with fresh bread and news. "Heard from the territorial governor," she said, settling into the chair beside him. "They want to name the new school after you. The Thorn Academy, they're calling it." "That's ridiculous. I'm not important enough for that." "You saved this town, probably saved a dozen others over the years, with the young men you've taught to be better than their worst instincts. If that's not important, I don't know what is." Eli sipped his coffee, considering. "Only if they include Rose's name too. The Thorn Academy sounds incomplete. Make it the Rose and Eli Thorn Academy. She's the one who did the real teaching, showing me how to be human. I'm just passing it along." Sarah smiled. "I'll tell them. They'll love it." She left after a while, and Eli sat alone on his porch watching the stars come out one by one, and thought about Rose, about the life they'd built together and the life he'd built after her, trying to honor her memory and her faith in him. He thought about Silas and Marcus and all the other ghosts that haunted his past, and he made his peace with them one more time. Then he went inside, pulled out the letter Rose had written him all those years ago, and read it again by lamplight, her words as fresh and powerful as they had been the first time he'd seen them. "Promise me you'll live, not just survive, but really live." He had. Against all odds and his own worst instincts, he'd kept that promise. And tomorrow he'd wake up and keep it again for as many tomorrows as he had left. Outside, the wind moved through the pines, carrying secrets and memories, and the sound of a world that kept turning no matter how many men died or lived or tried to be better than they were. And in his small house in a town that had become home, Eli Thorne, once known as the Ghost, closed his eyes and dreamed of mountains and pine trees, and a woman who'd believed in him when he couldn't believe in himself. The story was done. The legend was complete, and the man finally was at peace.